Thank you so much for spending time with me this evening. I really wish that we were together in person. And in some ways, that wish relates so much to our topic this evening of envisioning a grace filled America. Before we make that connection, let's spend a few minutes on the idea of a grace filled America, of civic grace, and why I'm here to discuss it. I co host a podcast, Pantsuit Politics, with Sarah Stewart Holland. Sarah and I met in college where we were acquaintances but not close friends. We reconnected on Facebook after we had both gone to law school. Sarah had a classic mommy blog that I started reading because of her Facebook post. It was a classic mommy blog in the sense that she talked about potty training and strollers and different ways to feed your baby, but it was different because she would sprinkle in thoughts on the Syrian civil war, for example. And that propensity to sprinkle in news and politics really drew me in. Sarah was also writing about childbirth in a way that I very much admired, and she was having her second baby as I was expecting my first. So I reached out to her for some advice, and that was the beginning of a new friendship as adults. Several years later, I wrote for her blog while I was on parental leave because I had found so much to agree with in Sarah's writing, but usually just came at issues from a slightly different take. And so it made for a good back and forth. And I did that again when my second child was born. Those parental leaves were windows when I wasn't so consumed with my work life that I was able to kind of resurface in the world as a whole person. The second time I wrote for her, I wrote a post called Nuance about social media and how strangely we all behave there. And that was the summer of 2015 when we were arguing with each other over things that seem quaint 5 years later. Should Caitlyn Jenner have won the Arthur Ashe Award? Exactly how tragic is the death of Cecil the Lion, who was killed by an American big game hunter? I wrote in that post about how I wish we could view each other as complete people when we say something controversial or political online. I wish that we could read each other's words without making weird and extreme assumptions about what else the person believes. I wish we could instead build in an assumption that this is a person, and so the story is a lot more complicated than what can come across in a status update or a tweet. The post generated lots of interest, and Sarah reached out and asked me if I'd be interested in creating a podcast with her. I had no idea what a podcast was. I was also a fairly private person working in a very conservative culture. And when I say conservative, I don't mean Republican. I mean like buttoned up and traditional, closed-toed shoes and business cards, and just not the kind of place where we share our feelings all over the internet. But something in Sarah's ask just felt right to me. It felt scary, but it felt good scary. So without understanding at all what I was getting into, I said yes, and Pantsuit Politics, a name that Sarah had been holding on to for a few years, was born. When we started, we used this idea of nuance as our guiding light. We wanted to get to the fine points of headline news and introduce our personal backstories and learn from each other so that we could refine our own viewpoints. We knew that by party and personality, we were predisposed to see things really differently. And we thought it would be good to just come together and see what came of that. So we started talking, and astonishingly to me, people started listening, and even more astonishingly, people started sharing their thoughts back to us in the form of exceptionally long emails. I think that over time, two things took us beyond nuance and into grace. First, being in constant conversation, not only with each other, but also with listeners from around the world, people sharing these very personal stories and experiences with us, helped me understand that some issues were actually less nuanced than I wanted them to be. I think that I had attitudes about race and poverty and other ways that people are marginalized that were pretty common among people like me, white, middle class, educated, married to a person of the opposite sex. I just didn't see the ways that systems create obstacles for my fellow Americans that I haven't had to face. That doesn't mean that I haven't had obstacles in my life. I certainly have, but there are so many additional obstacles that have never been visible to me. So I received from our listeners and their amazing generosity in sharing their stories with us, and a strong education about life experiences that are much harder than mine, and how ideas that seemed normal and sometimes obvious to me were actually harmful to them in ways that I had never intended. The second thing that moved us toward thinking more about grace than nuance is really not one thing. It's the combination of ways that the world has changed since 2015. The Republican Party's nomination of Donald Trump really changed that party in ways that were surprising to me and that created distance between me and the party. The election of Donald Trump shocked me and started to change, I think, everyone's understanding of American politics, whether they supported him or not. Brexit changed our understanding of European politics. Hong Kong's relationship with China has made us all think differently about what democracy means. The oppression of the Uyghurs in China, the fraught and illegitimate elections in many former Soviet states, the death of American service members in Niger, the way we've handled immigration in this country, the influx of Syrian refugees in Europe, the prediction that the future will be transformed by climate refugees. So much about the global and American order have shifted in the past 5 years. And now, of course, we have a pandemic. We have a reckoning with American racism prompted by the recorded murder of George Floyd. We have this election that involves changes to the way that we're voting and changes in the way we hear leaders talking about hypothetical results of our election. Everything is different than it was in 2015. Nuance still matters to us a lot when it's merited, but it just doesn't cut it when so much of what we're talking about clearly presents questions of who we want to be and who we don't, who gets to live and who does not. There are just very real existential questions in front of us almost every single day right now, and sometimes nuance is not what is called for in those settings. So when you're trying to express that you want to talk about politics differently, more wholly, more honestly, more courageously, with more curiosity, and also with a greater understanding of the limitations of your own perspective, what is a word or a concept big enough to encompass all of that? For us, the only option is grace. So civic grace for Sarah and me is the idea that every person belongs here. Not every idea. Some ideas are toxic and destructive. White supremacy, for example, does not belong. But every person belongs, and every person has value, regardless of that person's ideas and behaviors. It's that we don't dehumanize people. Our political opponents can be our opponents without being talked about or treated as human garbage. That sounds exceptionally simple and obvious. And it is simple and obvious. But simple does not mean easy. It is not easy. And obvious does not mean prevalent. It is not prevalent. So our challenge, I think, is to embody civic grace. That's all we can do, right? We live it ourselves, and we hope that in doing so, we're putting something good into the world. We have this challenge of embodying civic grace because it requires a tremendous amount of honesty and patience with and about ourselves so that we can speak honestly with others and have patience with them. That's really what our book intends to share. What we've learned about the process of being curious and open-hearted in our own understanding of politics so that we can communicate with one another in a healthier, more wholehearted way. And I know that individual work is important. When you work on yourself and then you're able to engage in grace-filled dialogue with other people, you have tremendous capacity for influence. So your good ideas can get some traction with others, or maybe you have the opportunity to mitigate an attitude or belief in someone else that you think is harmful. Maybe you have the absolutely mind-blowing experience of someday influencing how another person votes, or inspiring that person to run for office or to speak up when they see something that's wrong. Those are amazing results and opportunities, and they are wholly worth our effort. And also, we live in a time when I think that we all have a correct sense that something bigger than we can accomplish in this grace-filled version of retail politics can get. We are, I think, living through historic moments that will feature prominently in future textbooks. We're living through historic moments that challenge us right now, here in the present, to define what America is going to be for the next century. And that can feel so daunting, and it can feel daunting in ways that cause many of us to just opt out. So the first thing I want to say to you is please do not opt out. Please know that your individual voices matter enormously. Your vote might not ever be dispositive. That's not entirely off the table because many elections, especially local ones, are won by the thinnest of margins. But even if your vote is never dispositive, voting is a creative act. It's like the United States is a big canvas, and you show up to vote with your paintbrush to add to it what you'd like to see for our future. And that changes it. That matters, whatever the outcome is. So keep doing that work. And also, I think it is time to talk about what it looks like to scale up civic grace. What could a grace-filled America look like? Beyond these efforts to have better conversations individually, what could we do as a country to be more grace-filled? So I have a couple of ideas for that. First, I think it looks like continuing to work on America. We very often act like America is done. Like all of our best ideas happened in the 1800s. The founding fathers had perfect vision about what the future could look like, and were obviously smarter and deeper than anyone who could come after them. And so, hooray, we have a perfect constitution, we have a perfect system of government, we have all the right entities in place, we have the right number of people in those entities no matter what happens to our population, and onward we should continue in exactly the same fashion. And I think that when we really pause to consider that, the silliness of it springs forth. I think it's so important that we all come together, not about issues where we have real division along party lines, but to say, what's the infrastructure of our democracy going to continue to be? What do we want it? Can it hold the weight of modern America? And I think most of us, if we're honest, would answer that question in the negative. So I like to think about a song from one of my favorite performers, John Craigie. He says, if we want to make any kind of difference as musicians, we have to believe that we can be better than Bob Dylan and the people that he considers the musical greats. And I think that's true in our politics. We have to believe that we can do better than Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. We have to believe that we have some ideas that belong in the same chapters of history that those guys' ideas belonged in. And in some places that sounds almost arrogant or heretical. That's the word I'm looking for, heretical. But I believe strongly that there are people among us who absolutely belong on those pages of history, and that all of us have the capacity to continue to work together to think about how our government could work better. Our system is designed to be a work in progress. We have checks and balances for a reason. We have this balance of state versus federal power for a reason. We've never wanted one person or one family or one idea to define too much of our history or our present. And so when we think about that, when we imagine the founders sitting around saying we never want it to get defined too narrowly, we have to understand that I think they also wouldn't want it defined in ways that are too static, that are unresponsive to changes in the world and changes in population and changes in the needs of that population. And we also know that they told us that. They gave us a process that allows us to continue to write new laws. They gave us a process for amending the Constitution. They didn't even tell us too much about what that could look like. They left us lots of flexibility around making future changes to the government. And we know from many of their writings that they fully intended to write the first draft of America, not the dispositive draft of America. And I think that's so exciting. And so there are lots of things that we could be thinking about. Tons of states in this election have constitutional amendments on their ballots or ballot questions where they're asking the people of the state to make a choice about the state's future. I think we can scale that up to the federal level and keep that kind of action happening at the state level. We can talk about how we vote. Right now, we're seeing Americans apparently love to vote early. We have unbelievable participation in voting at this point in the process, weeks out from what we understand to be Election Day. And that's exciting. And that tells us, hey, there's something here to work with. We could change the way that we vote, not just for the pandemic, but going forward to make participation more accessible to people. This might not be the right version of that. It might not be that we want to use exactly what we've used for the pandemic to define those contours, but we could really go back to the drawing board and say, okay, what we saw is when people have a longer window, they show up. So how can we create a longer window in the future that meets any concerns about security, but also that makes voting more convenient and more exciting and more accessible? We could talk about how our ballots are actually counted and designed. The Electoral College is something that people ask Sarah and I about all the time. And the biggest thing that I want people to understand about the Electoral College is that it was designed at a time when you did not have these two parties dominating our political system. Many of the framers anticipated that Congress would always choose the president because the Electoral College wouldn't reach a decisive result. That's an entirely different framework. It was also designed at a time when citizens didn't directly vote for the president. So many pieces have changed. And so whether you think the Electoral College ought to exist as it currently does, or be abolished, or be rethought, and there are so many different ideas out there about how it could be rethought, it's a really important exercise to be asking those questions and not to be afraid of those questions. Because they prompt something new and different and unknown, but to lean into that as the work of being a citizen, saying like, yes, how do we elect our president? How does our process work? What is the balance of power among states with different populations and different geographic concerns? I think all of that is really fun and exciting. Same thing with how many representatives we have in Congress. We have had a population explosion since the last time we apportioned congressional representation. We have some congressional districts now where one member of the House of Representatives has 1 million constituents. And that seems very far from the vision of the House as the people's house, where you have very responsive representatives. We've argued since the founding of this country about how many people should be represented in that body. How many constituents is the right number of constituents to keep someone accountable and transparent without being beholden to extreme ideas. And I think it's just important to keep working on that. I think we need to talk about initiatives like ranked choice voting that would allow other parties to have a fighting chance in our elections so that more people's views are represented well. I think we need to talk about how elections are funded. I think we need to talk about our territories and the District of Columbia and what type of representation they have in the federal government. There are just so many places where there's good work to do. I won't even get started on the Supreme Court, which is my favorite thing to talk about, and I could talk about for days. If we all don't like what happens when a Supreme Court justice dies, I don't. This sense of collapse by people of one ideology and rejoicing by people of another ideology, and this race to get someone appointed. I don't think any of us can feel happy with how this process is working right now structurally, because if you change any of the variables, you could be in a position where you feel extremely disempowered and unrepresented in our government. And that's happening all the time to people of lots of different political stripes and locations. And so that to me just says we are in rich, fertile ground to continue working on our country. And I think there's a huge element of grace in that because it recognizes, again, that everybody belongs. and working toward a government where everybody belongs, everybody feels represented, everybody feels an opportunity to fairly make their way through an election. I think that's some of the most grace-filled work that we can do as a country. So those structural changes are the place that I would start. I also think, as we envision a more grace-filled America, that it requires a real examination of our place in the world. Real conversations are needed about American foreign policy. What are we trying to do? Who are we trying to be? I have no answers on this, but I have a lot of questions. My first question is whether America should continue the thread of thought that has existed in some administrations in my lifetime of spreading democracy in the world. I don't know the right balance between believing that a government democratically empowered by the people is always the best system, even though it is never a perfect system, or if it's more important to have respect for other cultures and other cultures' understanding of power and hierarchy and governance. I don't know where that goes over a line from being respect for other cultural traditions and into being an endorsement of oppression. I think that's a really difficult question that we all need to spend more time thinking about because it so influences what our strategies are when we move into other parts of the world. I think we need to ask questions about trade. There was an understanding expressed in the Federalist Papers that trade is really the gateway to peace and prosperity, that when you trade with other nations, you ensure a friendly partnership and a healthy sense of competition. And I don't know today where trade is that impetus for peace versus being a barrier to insisting on the best standards for humanity that we can. I think there are places where we in the United States are ignoring terrible human rights abuses because of our trade relationships with countries perpetuating those abuses. And I don't know where it's our job to step in and call that out. I think that our country has given away a lot of opportunities for meaningful work and creativity and high quality products because we have wanted to do trade with other countries and because that trade has led us to always looking for more cheaper goods. I think those are really hard questions that we need to ask as well. I have so many questions about the role of surveillance in the world and whether that kind of understanding of other countries surreptitiously is essential to our national security and where it is impermissibly intrusive and coming from an attitude of domination instead of respect for other countries. I have so many questions about whether and how we should prepare the right weapons to maintain a sense of stability in the world, that notion of peace through strength, and where we should, as the United States of America, be putting our weapons down so that we have the moral authority to call others to do the same. I have so many questions about space. I love thinking about space. We are littering space right now with objects in our effort to better understand it. So I have questions about what the ethical standards for space exploration look like, what sustainability looks like in space, what our obligations to other countries are as we make new discoveries in space. I don't think that we should be approaching space with the same mindset that explorers approached other parts of Earth earlier in our history. And I would love for us to all think together and to think as a country about the guideposts as we start to enter into space. I have questions about how we stop treating the Earth like we're consumers. I think how we stop treating the heavens like we're consumers in the case of space exploration and have a greater sense of caretaking toward it and how we work with other countries around that caretaking. I think that's a huge part of where we exist in the global order. Who gets to live in America and where else in the world Americans get to live? That flow of migration, I think, is going to be an essential part of our future. I mentioned refugees earlier. We know that the number of refugees in the world is only going to increase with time. Every scholar who studies this issue tells us that the movement of people throughout Earth is changing dramatically, and in ways that our food supply is not equipped for, in ways that our transportation and infrastructure are not equipped for. And I think that there are serious ethical issues when we start talking about who gets to live where and why and how and under what circumstances. And we need more principled approaches to that instead of just reactive approaches. So, all of those things, that any one topic of which we could spend months and years debating, I think are part of a more grace-filled American understanding of how we exist as citizens of the globe. I also think that a more grace-filled America requires a re-examination of many of our values from top to bottom. And I mean like zooming way out into our most fundamental values. You know, the prevalence of work in our lives, and this is something that I am predisposed to, can really dull out our sense of earnestness. We can really lose our ability to talk about things like faith and hope and love and what is moral and what is ethical when we just get in a pattern of like, is this quarter more profitable than the quarter before? I think that our addiction to work in this country has prevented us from asking better questions about what we're here to do and why, what each person's calling is, how we can all live the best life we hope to live, what we want for our children. It's just really difficult to break out of the tedium of every day and the stress of all of the systems that we've set up to kind of grade and measure who we are, and ask those big picture questions about what it is that we're doing here. What even is our country? What are we trying to have it be? And what for? What does any of that matter? I think that requires a real discussion about the role of caretaking in our country, not just raising children, but also how we take care of people as they age, how we take care of people who have unique physical and emotional and mental needs, how we take care of our spiritual needs. There are so many dimensions of just ensuring that every person is equally valued in terms of how they're able to conduct their lives that we've not even scratched the surface of. And I think a real emphasis on that is important to having a more grace-filled America. I think an examination of the role of technology in society is going to be essential as well. And that's another area where I have lots of questions and very few answers. But those questions matter, and the more we all ask them together, I think the more clarity will emerge. It's a beautiful thing that we're able to connect this way. And I also think that there is something lost when we connect this way versus being in the same room together. What does that mean for all of us? What does artificial intelligence mean about the human spirit? What does the ability of machines to accomplish what only human labor once could mean for all of our worthiness when so much of how we think of ourselves as people is attached to our work? I think medical ethics require so much examination. I've been thinking a lot about how my mom, who was recently hospitalized with COVID-19, received plasma early in her hospital stay, and it seems to have made a tremendous difference. And there's something to me that is so deep about the idea that another person donated plasma and that we have the capacity to extract that from one person and provide it to another. And as we continue to think about COVID-19 treatments, we get into stem cell research and all kinds of places where what we really believe about life is front and center. And I think we need to have those conversations, not just in the pitched battle of who sits on the Supreme Court and what that means for reproductive rights, but in terms of how we're able to treat disease in the future, how we're able to prevent disease, how we're able to prolong life. There are just so many big questions in front of us that really take an examination of values. And I think doing that work is essential to living in a more grace-filled America. I also think that civic grace looks like remembering that nothing happens singularly. And that means having a sense of history. I was recently asked what I think about people saying this is the most important election of our lives, because we say that every election. And the person who asked me said that it always makes him roll his eyes. And I told him, I completely understand why it makes you roll your eyes. And I also think that if believing this is the most important election in our lives motivates people to participate, then that's a good result, because I always want to be motivating more people to come into the political process. And at the same time, I think if we're really honest, we can't know what the most important election in our lives is. Always, what hits the desk of a president or a senator or a mayor changes things. It changes the course of history in ways predictable and in ways completely unforeseeable. And having that sense of history provides a built-in humility that I think we are so lacking in the way that we discuss politics right now. So really centering ourselves in where we've been is incredibly important to me. But having a sense of the future is incredibly important as well. And trying to think through not just what are the short-term, the next 5-year impacts of what we're talking about, but where will this lead us a decade from now? As much as we can know that, recognizing that we never can completely, as much as we can know that, how can we feel so connected to our descendants to come that we're always acting with their best interest at heart? I think we need a sense of the fact that we don't live in this country alone and that policy is not made in a vacuum. I tend to have pretty conservative beliefs about the role of the federal government in problem solving. And so I would not have voted in favor of the Affordable Care Act had I been a member of Congress when the Affordable Care Act was first introduced. But it passed through a legitimate democratic process. And so in the various attempts to repeal it that have happened over the past few years, I would not have cast a vote in favor of repeal, because it has created a new system that people are relying on. And I think once we've done something, we have to understand that it's not a light switch that can just be undone, that it has changed us. The creation of Social Security changed us. The creation of Medicaid changed us. The systems that we're creating now and that will continue to be created in response to this pandemic will change us. And maybe if that were just an academic exercise in a textbook, people like me would say all the time, oh, that was too much, that was too far. But it doesn't matter once it's done. Once it's done, then I think the question is, okay, how do we responsibly administer this going forward? How do we effectively administer it going forward? How do we learn from any places that seem like overreach? And was I wrong about it being overreach? When we are asked to describe our political views to one another, I think we're often asked to describe them as though the only thing that matters is whether I give this personally a thumbs up or a thumbs down, instead of asking, how does this affect everyone around me? How has it affected those who've come before me? How will it affect those who've come after? When I consider all of that, where do I land on the next question? I think we also just need to preserve this sense that everything we do, even individually, impacts other people. And that brings me back to where I started. I think the fact that we are meeting today in this way exemplifies civic grace. We're spending time together thinking about our democracy, which is amazing and gives me so much hope. And we're doing it in a format that is personally not what we would wish it to be. We're doing it digitally instead of in person because we all have awareness that our travel and our movements and our gathering creates a risk to other people that right now is an unacceptably high risk. And I'm not appearing digitally because I fear contracting COVID-19, but because we all here together have a sense of awareness about how our choices impact other people, and we care about that. It matters to us. What we're living through right now is terrible. I will never look for silver linings in it. And also, a sense of awareness about the ways our choices impact others is a tremendous gift. And it is a massive step toward living in a country with better ways of living in community together. That's all politics is, how we live in community with one another. And I know that shift toward a more grace-filled America, even with these big, daunting questions that we've been discussing today, I know that shift is within our reach if we want it. And I thank you so much for spending your time imagining it with me and working toward it with me.